I grew up believing that no matter how flawed I was, there would always be a seat for me at my parents' table, a place on their boat, a corner in their world. But that afternoon in Miami, my father looked me in the eye and told me there wasn't enough room for me on the yacht, while my mother nodded, as if I were nothing but extra luggage. I watched them bored laughter spilling like champagne bubbles, their arms wrapped around Daniel and Charlotte as if they were the only children who mattered. And in that hollow silence as the waves lapped against the dock, I realized they had pushed me out for the last time. What they didn't know was that I was about to step onto a yacht so grand, so untouchable, that their entire world of status and pride would sink the moment they saw me standing there. The sun beat down on the marina in Miami, glinting off the rows of sleek white yachts lined up like floating palaces. I stood at the edge of the dock with my small overnight bag at my feet, the heat pressing into my shoulders, trying to keep my face calm, even as my stomach twisted. My family was already there, gathered in their coordinated resort outfits, laughing and chatting with the crew as if I were invisible. My father, Richard, adjusted his linen blazer, the kind of casual but expensive look he perfected years ago, and looked at me the way he often did, like I had wandered into a room where I did not belong. My mother, Margaret, smoothed the brim of her wide straw hat, her bracelets chiming softly. When she finally turned toward me, her voice was light but sharp. "There is not enough room this time, Olivia. You should stay behind." I blinked, unsure I had heard her right. The yacht behind her was massive, gleaming white, with 3 decks, the kind of boat people stop to take pictures of. I knew it could fit at least 20 comfortably. My father's tone cut through any hesitation. "Yes, this trip is for Daniel and Charlotte and their spouses. It will be crowded enough already. You understand." I glanced past them toward the boarding ramp. My brother Daniel was laughing with his wife on the lower deck, a glass of champagne already in his hand, though we had not even left the dock. My sister Charlotte posed against the railing, while her husband filmed a short video for her followers, her voice sing-song and perfect for Instagram. There were at least 4 seats open on the aft deck, plush and waiting, yet I was being told there was no space. I managed a thin smile, though my chest burned. Of course, I would not want to intrude. Margaret's lips curved in satisfaction, as if I had passed some unspoken test. "Good girl. You will have the house to yourself for the weekend." They turned away before I could say more, their attention shifting back to the captain and the servers unloading cases of sparkling wine. My hand tightened around the handle of my bag. I had packed carefully, choosing the light dresses and sandals I thought would finally make me look like I belonged in family photos, though, deep down, I knew I would still be the one cut from the frame. Richard's laugh carried across the dock as he clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "You have earned this, son. Everything you are building it is exactly what I hoped for." Charlotte twirled, her white cover-up fluttering as she called out, "Get my good side, babe." Her husband grinned behind the phone. I stood apart, the humid air, thick salt clinging to my lips. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would pierce their arrogance, but all that came was silence. Instead, I watched as the crew ushered my family up the gangway one by one, their shoes clicking against the polished wood. No one looked back at me, not even once. As the engines rumbled to life, a cheer went up from the upper deck. Music started muffled but bright, the kind that promised champagne and selfies and endless laughter. I stayed rooted on the dock, my heart hammering in my ears. The yacht began to pull away slowly, the water parting in gentle waves. I caught the last glimpse of Charlotte lifting her glass to toast her laughter carried across the water before the sound was swallowed by the sea. My reflection stared back at me from the surface, small and distorted, while behind it, their world of wealth and ease floated farther away. The bag at my feet felt heavier than it should have, the strap digging into my palm when I finally bent to pick it up. I did not cry. I did not call out. I simply stood in the Miami heat, the crowd on the marina moving past me until the yacht was nothing more than a blur against the horizon. I turned away, then each step slow but steady, my chest hollow, yet burning with something sharper than pain. It was the moment I knew without question that I was done being their afterthought, The drive back from the marina blurred past the windshield palm trees, whipping by the sound of waves fading, until all that remained was the low hum of traffic. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. I could still see their faces, the way my father's smile widened for Daniel, the way my mother's eyes softened when she looked at Charlotte. For me, there had always been only impatience, a quiet disappointment they never bothered to hide. I parked outside my small apartment in Coral Gables and sat there for a moment staring at the cracked sidewalk. Memories I had spent years shoving down rose up uninvited. Christmas mornings when I was little came back in sharp detail. Daniel had unwrapped a new bike, shiny blue with a bow on the handlebars. Charlotte got a dollhouse taller than she was with miniature furniture and working lights. My gift had been a sweater 2 sizes too big folded neatly in a box. My mother had said it was practical that I would grow into it. On birthdays, the pattern never changed. Daniel had sleepovers at arcades, entire pizza parlors rented out. Charlotte had elaborate spa parties by the pool. I remember turning 12, sitting at the dining table with a cupcake and a single candle. My parents had forgotten to order a cake. Richard had laughed, saying at least it would not go to my hips, and Margaret had handed me a bookstore gift card worth $20. The hurt from those moments never left. It sat in me like stones, heavy but familiar. Even at school, I noticed how teachers reacted when my parents arrived for Daniel's science fair or Charlotte's dance recital. Richard and Margaret beamed with pride, shaking hands, praising their talents. When I brought home drawings or small trophies, the response was always muted. "That is nice, Olivia. Now go set the table." I got out of the car and carried my bag upstairs, the hallway dim and quiet compared to the marina's chaos. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender from the candle I had left burning that morning. I dropped the bag on the couch and stood in the center of the room, breathing hard. My chest ached, as if those old moments were fresh wounds. A memory from high school cut through next. Charlotte had been crowned homecoming queen. Margaret spent weeks shopping for the perfect gown, arranging appointments, making sure every curl in her daughter's hair was flawless. The night I came home with a letter saying I had been accepted to a local art program, she had not even looked up from sewing a button on Daniel's suit jacket. Later, she told me design was not a real career, that I should consider teaching or secretarial work instead. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table staring at the condensation dripping down the side. That was the way it had always been. They decided what mattered and what did not. They decided who shined and who stayed in the shadows. I had played along for years thinking if I worked harder, if I kept quiet, maybe they would finally see me. But they never did. The silence of the apartment pressed in almost too loud. I rubbed my temples, flashes of holidays and milestones circling in my head. Daniel's graduation from MIT had been treated like a national holiday. Charlotte, hitting 1 million followers on social media, had earned her a champagne party in the backyard. When I signed my first independent design contract with a small firm in Wynwood, no one came to see the studio I had poured my soul into. Richard had said he hoped it was just a phase. I stood and paced the room, the anger building hotter than the Miami sun outside. For so long I had buried it, convinced myself that it was not worth the fight. But today on that dock, being told I was not worth a seat had snapped something I did not realize was so fragile. I opened the sliding glass door and stepped onto the balcony. The evening air was sticky, the skyline lit with the glow of the city. Somewhere far out there, my family was clinking glasses, their laughter floating over the waves. I could almost hear Charlotte's high-pitched voice, Daniel's easy confidence, and Margaret's polite laugh. They had written me out of their story long ago, and I had let them. Not anymore. I leaned on the railing, fingers curling tight around the metal. My whole life I had been the extra place, setting the afterthought, the mistake they dressed up in polite excuses. That image of myself burned in my mind, and with it came something else sharper and stronger. A vow. I whispered it into the night, my voice steady, though no one was there to hear. I will never let them crush me again. The words settled into me like steel, anchoring deeper than any wound. I stayed there as the city lights flickered, a new resolve taking root, knowing that this was the moment my life would no longer bend to their hands. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. My eyes were gritty from too little sleep, but when I saw the name on the screen, my heart gave a small jolt. Ethan Blake. It had been months since I last spoke to him. I answered quickly, trying to clear the sleep from my voice. Ethan's tone was warm, steady, the kind of voice that always managed to ground me. He was in Los Angeles preparing for a round of meetings with his venture fund, but he asked how I was doing. I hesitated, then let the words spill out, telling him about what had happened at the marina, about standing on the dock while my family sailed away. There was a pause on the line, and then his voice calm, but firm. Olivia, they have treated you like this for too long. You don't have to accept it anymore. I closed my eyes, leaning against the cool wall of the kitchen. He had seen it before, of course. We met 2 years earlier when his firm hired me to design the interiors of their new offices in downtown Los Angeles. I was terrified walking into that pitch surrounded by architects twice my age, but Ethan had noticed me. He had watched quietly as I explained my ideas, not just the look, but the way the space could make people feel valued, inspired, capable. Later he told me it was the way I fought for details that others overlooked that caught his attention. He had stopped by the site often during construction, sometimes in a suit straight from a board meeting, sometimes in jeans and a t-shirt, when no one expected the billionaire CEO to appear. We spoke about design and work, but also about choices, about not letting others define who we were. He was older than me by 6 years, but never once did he make me feel small. That morning, hearing his voice again, I felt a calm spread through the storm still raging in me. He asked if I was free that weekend. I almost laughed. Free was all I had been left with. He went on, his words measured, but carrying an undercurrent of intent. I'm taking the Orion out of Miami on Saturday. Just a few friends, quiet water, no crowds. I want you there. I walked to the balcony, phone pressed tight to my ear, staring at the skyline that had felt suffocating just hours earlier. The Orion. I had heard of his yacht, but only in passing, whispered about in business magazines and glossy profiles. I imagined the polished decks, the endless horizon, the silence of being away from the city. Ethan continued, almost as if he sensed my hesitation. You don't need to prove anything to them. Let me show you what it feels like to be somewhere you belong. My throat tightened, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. For so long I had been scrambling for scraps of approval from people who would never give it. Now here was someone offering space without condition. I agreed, my voice soft but certain. Yes, I'll come. The rest of the week stretched on in a haze of anticipation. I tried to focus on client sketches, on invoices that needed filing, but my mind drifted. I thought about the first time Ethan had walked into my half-finished studio in Wynwood, how he had studied the mood boards taped to the wall, the color swatches spread across my desk. He had said my vision carried weight. No one in my family had ever used that word about me. On Friday evening, he texted me the details. A car would pick me up at noon, take me directly to the private marina. No fuss, he wrote, just sunshine and salt air. Saturday arrived with skies so blue they looked unreal. The car pulled up in front of my building, black and gleaming, the driver professional and polite. I slid into the back seat, my small bag beside me, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of excitement instead of dread. The drive to the marina was smooth, the streets lined with people heading to beaches and brunches, none of them aware of the storm of emotions inside me. When we arrived, I stepped out, and there it was, the Orion. It dwarfed every other vessel around it, a vision of white steel and glass stretching across the water. Crew members moved with quiet precision, preparing for departure. The sun flashed against its upper decks, and for a moment, I simply stood there, breath caught in my chest. Ethan was waiting at the foot of the gangway, dressed casually in a pale shirt, his sunglasses pushed back into his hair. When he saw me, his smile was easy, genuine. Olivia, welcome. I walked toward him, my sandals clicking against the dock, the scent of salt and fuel heavy in the air. For once, I did not feel like an afterthought. He reached for my bag, but I shook my head, carrying it myself. His eyes held mine for a moment, something unspoken passing between us. Then he nodded as if to say he understood. As we boarded, the hum of engines vibrated beneath my feet, steady and powerful. Ethan guided me toward the deck, where a chilled glass of sparkling water waited. The horizon stretched open, endless and free, and for the first time in days, I felt my shoulders ease. I looked back once at the city skyline, shrinking behind us, the glitter of Miami fading into distance. Ahead lay only water, open and inviting. I did not know what the weekend would bring, but in that moment, standing beside Ethan on the deck of the Orion, I knew I had stepped into a different chapter of my life. My family's yacht had always been a point of pride for them, a sleek vessel they bragged about at parties and fundraisers. $8 million, my father liked to remind people, though the way he said it made it sound like pocket change. I had spent time on it before, crammed into the lounge while Daniel entertained his business contacts and Charlotte staged perfect photos on the sun deck. It was beautiful in its own way, polished wood and leather seating, but it was crowded, loud, filled with too many people talking over each other and not enough room to breathe. Even when there was space, I was treated like an uninvited guest, a shadow pressed against the wall. The Orion was another world. As soon as my feet touched the deck, I felt it. Everything about it exuded silence and control, not in an oppressive way, but in a way that told you every detail had been considered, nothing left to chance. The yacht stretched across the water like a floating palace, its lines sharp and graceful. Crew members moved quietly, offering warm smiles and chilled glasses of champagne without hovering. Ethan led me along the main deck, pointing out spaces almost casually. To my left was a pool lined with pale stone tiles, water glittering beneath the sun. Beyond it, a glass door slid open into a lounge that looked more like a five-star hotel than anything that should have been floating. Plush cream sofas, modern art hanging on the walls, a grand piano gleaming in the corner. My breath caught when I realized there was a spiral staircase curving upward toward a second-deck, sunlight streaming down through a skylight above. He guided me toward a private dining room, where a long table was set with polished silver and crystal glasses. Beyond that, another door revealed a suite with wide windows looking out over the ocean, a bed draped in white linens, and a bathroom larger than my entire apartment back home. The marble counters glowed under soft lighting, a deep soaking tub positioned beside the window, as if daring someone to take a bath in full view of the horizon. I followed him back onto the open deck, where a small aircraft rested on a platform at the stern. A seaplane, he explained casually, ready for short trips to the islands whenever he felt like it. My head spun. My family's yacht, which they flaunted so proudly, suddenly seemed like a toy boat next to this. The difference was not just in the size or the price tag. It was in the atmosphere. On my parents' yacht, there had always been a need to perform to prove worthiness. Glasses clinked too loudly. Laughter rang, false conversations were measured by who could outdo the other. Here on the Orion, I felt something I had not known I craved: peace, respect, space to exist without judgment. Ethan handed me a flute of champagne, the bubbles catching the sunlight as I lifted it. To new beginnings, he said, his voice steady, but his eyes watching me closely. I took a sip, the crisp taste sharp against my tongue, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the drink. I wandered toward the railing, the breeze tangling my hair as I looked out across the open sea. Behind us, Miami was shrinking into the distance, the skyline a blur against the horizon. Somewhere out there, my family was gathered on their crowded deck, posing for photos, congratulating themselves on exclusivity. They had told me there was no room for me, as if I were an inconvenience. Now here I was, standing on a vessel worth nearly 20 times theirs, invited not because of obligation, but because someone saw value in me. Ethan joined me at the railing, his shoulder brushing mine. "You belong here, Olivia," he said quietly. It was not a line, not a performance, just truth spoken with certainty. For a moment I could not answer. My throat tightened, and I had to blink against the sting in my eyes. We moved to the lounge as the yacht picked up speed, the water rushing past in a blur of turquoise and white foam. I sank into the sofa, the fabric cool against my skin, and for the first time in days, I let myself exhale fully. The staff moved around us with effortless precision, refilling glasses, arranging fruit and small plates, yet never intruding. It was as if the entire space had been designed to allow me to simply exist without needing to apologize for taking up room. Later, Ethan showed me the upper deck, where private cabanas offered shade and comfort, and a helipad gleamed under the sun. Each detail was a reminder of the scale of his world, a world I had only glimpsed through magazines or passing mentions. He carried it lightly, though. There was no boast in his tone, only a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of what was his. I stood at the bow as the yacht cut through the waves, wind whipping against my face, the salt air clinging to my skin. I thought about my family's laughter echoing across the cheaper decks of their yacht, the way they had looked at me as if I were less. That image dissolved in the spray of the sea. Here I was seen not as an obligation, but as someone worth inviting, worth sharing space with. As the afternoon stretched on, the water deepened into a richer blue, the coastline vanishing entirely until only the endless horizon remained. The sun slid lower, casting golden light across the deck, and I realized with a quiet certainty that I was no longer bound by their rejection. The Orion carried me forward each mile, a reminder that I had stepped into a place they could not touch. When the crew lit soft lanterns along the deck and the air cooled, I sank into a cushioned chair with another glass in hand, watching the first stars appear overhead. The hum of the engines was steady, a rhythm that seemed to echo the steadiness rising inside me. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the waves carry me. It was the first time I had ever felt without question that I belonged. The morning after we docked at a quiet cove near Key Largo, I woke to the sound of gulls and the gentle sway of the Orion. My phone, which I had left face down on the nightstand, buzzed again and again until I finally reached for it. The screen lit up with notifications, dozens of them, texts from acquaintances I had not heard from in years, tags and mentions filling my social feeds. At first I thought it was some mistake until I saw the headline flashing across my screen. Olivia Morgan spotted on private yacht with billionaire investor Ethan Blake. My breath caught. A glossy photo showed me leaning on the railing of the Orion, champagne in hand, the ocean stretching endlessly behind me. Ethan stood beside me, casual and composed, one hand in his pocket. The credit beneath the photo read, "Michael Grant, Miami Gazette." My pulse quickened. I had noticed a man with a long lens on the dock before we left, but assumed he was just another tourist. Clearly, he had been waiting for us. Scrolling further, I found the image everywhere. Instagram, Twitter, local news blogs. My name attached to Ethan's in bold letters, speculations spilling into the captions. Who is Olivia Morgan? Interior designer or new girlfriend? The comments were relentless, some admiring, others sneering, each one dissecting me like I was a headline instead of a person. By noon, my phone rang. The name flashing across the screen made my stomach twist. Margaret. I almost let it go to voicemail, but my hand betrayed me and I answered. Her voice came sharp, not with concern, but with that familiar blend of condescension and judgment. So this is what you are doing now, Olivia. Latching onto a man with money. I could almost see her pursed lips through the phone, the smug tilt of her head, as she imagined me scrambling for scraps at Ethan's table. I gripped the railing, staring out at the waves to steady myself. I am working, I said flatly, designing, living my life. She laughed, a brittle sound. Working, darling. The entire city thinks you are someone's weekend entertainment. Daniel showed me the photos. Charlotte's friends are already gossiping. Do you know how this makes us look? The words sliced deep, but beneath the sting there was a shift, a quiet realization. For the first time, it was not me who was embarrassed. It was them, their friends whispering about their daughter, not as the family's failure, but as the woman standing beside a man who commanded rooms they could never enter. I let the silence stretch before answering. How it makes you look is not my problem. Her intake of breath was audible, sharp and quick, but before she could reply, I ended the call. My hand shook, not from fear, but from adrenaline, the thrill of finally cutting her words short before they could burrow into me. Ethan found me still clutching the phone on the deck. He studied my face for a moment, then nodded toward the lounge where breakfast waited. Let them talk, he said gently. You know who you are. I wanted to believe that wanted it to be as simple as stepping onto a different yacht and leaving the weight behind. Yet the voices still echoed my mother's, especially sharp and cold. I sat with Ethan, forcing myself to eat a slice of fresh fruit, while the sea breeze carried the faint sound of laughter from the other side of the cove, where smaller yachts bobbed. Throughout the afternoon, more messages poured in. A high school acquaintance asking if I could introduce her to Ethan. A former client wanting to know if I was available for a feature in a lifestyle magazine. Even a distant cousin who had ignored me for years suddenly sent a cheerful note about catching up. All of them circling now that my name was attached to his. That evening, as the sun sank low, painting the water in streaks of gold and pink, I set my phone down and tried to let it go. Ethan poured 2 glasses of wine, handing me one without a word. The deck was quiet, the city far behind us, but in the distance I could feel the hum of voices online, the narrative spinning without my consent. For years I had been invisible to my family, an afterthought in every gathering, yet with one photo I had become unavoidable. They had told me there was no room for me on their yacht. Now the world was watching me on his. As the stars blinked awake above us, I sipped my wine and allowed the silence to settle. My family's judgment would not vanish overnight, and the gossip would only grow louder. But sitting there, the ocean stretching infinite in every direction, I realized that their words had finally begun to lose their power. The invitation came as a text from my father, though it felt more like a summons than an invitation. "Dinner in San Diego," he wrote. "Everyone will be there." There was no pleas, no softness, just the expectation that I would show up to face whatever judgment they had decided on this time. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but something inside me pushed back. I had hidden too many times before. Now I needed them to see me differently. The restaurant was one of their favorites, perched along the marina, with wide glass windows overlooking the harbor. By the time I walked in, the sky outside was streaked with orange and purple, the last light catching on the masts of the boat swaying gently below. My family was already seated at a long table, their voices low but sharp, the kind of tone they always slipped into when gossiping about someone who was not there. Daniel looked up first, his smirk immediate. "So the celebrity arrives," he said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a smile that carried no warmth. "You are trending, Olivia," she added, her phone resting on the table, the glow of Instagram still fresh on the screen. "Everyone wants to know how long it will last." I sat down across from them, the weight of their eyes pressing against me. My mother adjusted her napkin, avoiding my gaze, while my father cleared his throat, as if preparing for a court argument. "We are concerned, Olivia," he began, his voice practiced and deliberate. "Concerned that you are attaching yourself to something unstable. Men like Ethan Blake, they do not stay." Daniel laughed, cutting him off. "Let's call it what it is." She saw her chance and took it. Gold digger chic. Heat flushed my cheeks, but I kept my voice steady. "I am not using anyone." Charlotte tilted her head, her earrings catching the candlelight. "Please, Olivia. You could not handle the family yacht, and now suddenly you are pictured on one 10 times the size. People are not stupid." I set my fork down, the metal clinking against the plate louder than I intended. For years I had swallowed their words, letting them pile onto me until I almost believed them. But not tonight. Not anymore. I leaned forward, my eyes locking on theirs one by one. "I do not need your approval. I do not need your money. I built my career without your help. I have stood on my own feet, while you dismissed me as nothing. If you want to laugh, laugh. But do not mistake me for someone who will sit here quietly and take it." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through. Even my mother lifted her eyes at that, her expression caught between surprise and something else I could not read. My father's jaw tightened, the muscle working as if he wanted to argue, but could not find the words quickly enough. Daniel finally broke the silence, scoffing, as he reached for his glass of wine. "You sound rehearsed," he muttered, "like a bad reality show contestant." I let his words hang in the air without a response. For once, the weight of them slid off me instead of sinking in. I picked up my water, took a slow sip, and sat back. The control that had always belonged to them now felt like it was shifting inch by inch across the table. Dinner continued, though the atmosphere had fractured. Conversation turned brittle, broken by awkward pauses. Every so often, Charlotte glanced at her phone, scrolling, her lips pressed tight. My father focused on his steak, as if it were a case file, avoiding my eyes. My mother dabbed at her lips, her gaze flickering toward me and away again. By the time dessert arrived, I no longer cared whether they approved. The marina lights outside reflected across the windows, casting glimmers across the tablecloth, and I realized I had never felt more certain of myself than I did in that moment. I pushed my chair back and stood, the legs scraping softly against the floor. "Thank you for dinner," I said evenly. "I will let you handle the gossip in whatever way you want. That is not my burden anymore." I walked out into the night air, the sound of the water slapping against the docks, a steady rhythm under my steps. For the first time, I did not feel like I was leaving in shame. I was walking away on my own terms, their voices fading behind me as the city lights stretched open ahead. The night after the dinner in San Diego, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. "There will be a family meeting tomorrow afternoon at the office," it read. No explanations, no courtesy, just the cold authority of a man who had always assumed I would obey. For a moment I considered deleting it, but curiosity lingered like a thorn. I knew they had more to say, and I wanted to hear it from their own mouths. The next day, I walked into my father's downtown office, a sleek glass building that seemed designed to intimidate. The conference room was set with polished wood leather chairs, and the faint smell of old legal pads and fresh coffee. Richard sat at the head of the table, Margaret at his side, Daniel leaning back with his arms crossed, and Charlotte scrolling on her phone, barely glancing up when I entered. Richard folded his hands, his silver watch catching the light. "We need to be transparent about the future, Olivia. I have drafted my will, and I think it is time you hear it directly." The room seemed to tighten around me. My father reached for a folder and slid a crisp set of papers across the table. His voice carried the same practiced authority I had grown up with. "The estate, which currently stands at approximately $12 million, will be divided evenly between Daniel and Charlotte. They will carry on the family's legacy and assets." The words landed like stones in the silence that followed. I flipped through the pages, reading the neat lines of legal language that made my existence vanish from their legacy entirely. Not a cent, not a mention beyond a perfunctory acknowledgement that I was in fact his daughter. Charlotte smirked. "I hope you don't take it personally, Liv. It's just, you've never really been part of the core." Daniel chuckled under his breath. "Think of it as freedom. You don't have to carry the burden of responsibility." I set the papers back on the table, carefully refusing to let them see the sting. My hands were steady, even as my heart pressed against my ribs. "Thank you for letting me know," I said softly, then stood and walked out before they could throw more barbs. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already in my hand. There was one person I trusted enough to call: Victoria Hayes. We had met years ago at a charity gala, back when I was still trying to carve out space for myself in Los Angeles. She was sharp, fearless, and known for her work in financial law. I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. "Olivia Morgan," she said, her tone both surprised and amused. "It has been a long time." "I need your help," I said quickly, my voice low. "It is about my family, and it is about money." Within hours, we were sitting across from each other in her office, papers spread across the desk, as I explained what had just unfolded. She listened without interruption, her eyes narrowing slightly, as I laid out the details of the will. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "That explains the will, but you called me for something more. What are you really after?" I hesitated, then pulled a thin file from my bag. Years ago, I had stumbled across tax documents in my father's study, tucked into a folder with my name on it. At the time, I had not fully understood, but something about it had gnawed at me. I had kept copies hidden away, forgotten until now. I slid them across the desk. Victoria scanned them quickly, her brows lifting as she pieced it together. "Olivia, these forms list you as a beneficiary of shell accounts. Look at these dates. This was when your father was restructuring assets after that firm merger. He used your name, your social security number. If the IRS looked at this now, it would not just be a family embarrassment. It would be fraud. The word hit like a spark catching dry kindling. Fraud. Not just whispers of favoritism or slights at the dinner table, but something tangible, something dangerous. My father had always assumed I was powerless, that his wealth and influence made him untouchable. But now in black and white, there was proof that he had dragged me into his schemes without my consent. Victoria leaned forward, her voice steady. You have leverage, Olivia. Strong leverage. If he tries to push you out completely, this gives you the ability to push back. But you need to be careful. This is not a game. I nodded slowly, my fingers tightening on the edge of the desk. For the first time, I felt something sharper than hurt or anger. It was control. I had the power to make them answer for what they had done, not just to me, but in the eyes of the law. As I left her office, the city lights glowed against the evening sky, and a sense of calm settled over me. They thought I had nothing, that I was disposable, but the truth was now in my hands, and I intended to use it. The first headline reached me through a text from a colleague. Olivia Morgan seen clinging to billionaire Ethan Blake. Family sources call her a dependent freeloader. The words flashed on my screen, sharp as glass. I scrolled down to see grainy photos of me laughing on the deck of Ethan's yacht, champagne in hand, while the caption painted me as someone who had no life of her own outside of a man's shadow. My stomach tightened, but beneath the sting was recognition. This had my family's fingerprints all over it. They had fed the press, hoping to crush me in public the way they had always tried to in private. The next morning I walked into a cafe in West Hollywood, my sunglasses shielding me from curious eyes. Michael Grant was already there, tapping at his laptop, the glow of the screen reflected in his glasses. He looked up when I approached, closing the device with deliberate calm. Olivia, thank you for agreeing to meet. His voice was even professional, but I caught the flicker of curiosity beneath it. Your family has been very vocal. They claim you are exploiting Ethan Blake for status and money. I removed my glasses and set them on the table. Is that what you believe too? He shook his head slightly. I don't run gossip. I want the truth from your side. But if I print without proof, it becomes noise. I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. Proof is exactly what I have. Not about Ethan, but about them. You will get your story, but only when I decide the timing. He studied me, his pen resting above his notebook. What are you asking of me? Hold it, I said. Hold the story until I can give you the documents that show what they've been hiding. When this comes out, I don't want it to be just a defense. I want it to be the full picture. He nodded slowly, a spark of intrigue lighting his expression. I can do that. But Olivia, when this breaks, it will not just shake your family. It will drag every part of your life into the spotlight. I straightened in my chair. Then let it. They already tried to humiliate me in public. I am not going to let their version be the only one people hear. That night, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, the city buzzing beneath me, the air heavy with the smell of summer heat and car exhaust. Ethan called, his voice warm, concerned. I told him about the headlines, about the meeting with Michael. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, If you want to go public, I'll back you. But make sure you know where this leads. Once it starts, there's no pulling back. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. I have lived my whole life under their shadow, Ethan. This is the first time I see a way to stand in the light. The following week, the tabloids doubled down. Anonymous sources close to the family whispered that I had been cut out of the will because of irresponsibility, that Ethan was my only lifeline. The stories spread like wildfire, picked up by online forums and Instagram accounts hungry for drama. I read the comments late at night, some cruel, some sympathetic, all of them feeding the storm. Victoria called me into her office. Her tone was brisk, efficient. The more they push this angle, the more your leverage grows. They are framing you as the outsider. But remember, you hold the documents that prove who crossed the line. I placed the folder on her desk, the same one I had carried from my father's study years ago. She slid it open, reviewing the records again. With this, you are not just fighting back emotionally. You are hitting them where it hurts most, their reputation and their legal standing. For the first time, I let myself smile. This was no longer about pleading for recognition or scraps of approval. It was about making sure the truth cut through the lies they spun. Michael reached out again, pressing gently. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Almost," I told him. "When the time is right, I'll hand you everything. Until then, you hold steady." He agreed, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight shift in my favor. The scandal had started as their weapon, but I was determined to turn it into mine, and the moment to strike was getting closer. The week after I met with Michael became a blur of calendars and site visits. Ethan called from his office in Santa Monica with a tone that meant business and asked if I could come in the next morning. When I arrived, the conference room looked out over bougainvillea and glass towers, and a scale model waited in the center of the table like a small island of possibility. He explained that his fund had closed on a coastal property in the Florida Keys, and that the developers were auditioning firms for a complete resort design. He said my name had come up because the board wanted a vision that felt contemporary, but human, something that could stand through storms and seasons without losing its soul. My pulse quickened in a way that had nothing to do with headlines. By noon, I was walking the property with the development team, my shoes sinking into sand that smelled faintly of salt and mangrove. Pelicans glided low over the water, and a line of weathered docks pointed toward open sea. The brief was simple on paper and complicated in reality. Master plan for a boutique resort with 100 keys, 2 restaurants, a small spa, a beach club, and event spaces. The budget for design and interiors ran into the many millions, with a timeline that would make most firms flinch. I felt the old fear rise like a tide, and then I remembered the dock in Miami, and the way I had promised myself I would not bend anymore. I told the team I would have a concept within 3 weeks, and a full schematic a month after that. Back in Los Angeles, I set up shop in my studio, pinning sketches across the wall, until the room looked like a map of my thoughts. I pulled colors from the water and the limestone-built palettes that shifted from dawn to dusk, and argued with myself over whether the spa should feel like a grotto or a greenhouse. I drove to showrooms, ran my hands over fabrics called suppliers, about recycled terrazzo and sustainably harvested cypress. At night, I fell asleep on the sofa with floor plans open across my lap and woke with a pencil still in my hand. The first meeting with the broader group happened at Ethan's office. A consultant hired by the developers sat across from me, a gray-haired architect with a polite skepticism that read like a raised eyebrow. He asked if my small studio could handle a program of this complexity. I did not answer with apologies. I walked him through phasing maps, staffing plans, and vendor bench strength. I showed him how we would pre-approve alternates so that a supply chain hiccup could not derail the schedule. When I finished, he nodded once and said that contingency thinking was solid. Ethan did not speak for me, and I was grateful for that. He simply watched as if this were always what he knew I could do. The family noise rose the moment the first rumor of the project leaked. Charlotte posted a story implying that I was just staging pretty rooms for photographs. Daniel sent a message to a developer he knew hinting that my license and insurance might not be in order. My father called an old friend on a bank board to suggest that the investors consider a larger firm. Victoria forwarded me the chatter with a note that read, "Only stay steady." I responded to the developer with scanned certificates references and a list of completed projects with budgets and timelines attached. I thanked him for due diligence and returned to my drawings. 2 weeks later, the Keys property threw its first punch. A shipment of custom tile from Spain stalled at the port with no release in sight. The critical path now had a hole where the spa floor should be. I stared at the spreadsheet until the numbers blurred, then called a ceramicist in Miami I had met years ago at a street market. He worked with recycled glass and local clays, and he said he could produce a mosaic field in 2 weeks if I could lock the pattern that night. I scrapped the old scheme, drove to his studio, and sketched until my hand cramped. The new floor looked like waves caught in stone. It was better than what I had planned. A day later, the building inspector flagged our beach club ramp for non-compliance. The slope was off by a fraction that would matter to a wheelchair, and therefore mattered to me. We regraded the approach, shifted a planter, and added a compact lift disguised within a wall of vertical slats. The change saved minutes for someone who needed them most and barely touched the budget. The consultant with the raised eyebrow sent a brief message that said the solution was elegant. I printed it and pinned it above my desk for the night I knew would arrive when doubt crept back in. Press clippings still trickled into my phone, the worst ones calling me a passenger in someone else's life. I stopped reading after midnight. In the morning, an editor from a design journal reached out and asked if they could preview a small part of the concept once it was public. She said a younger voice with a rigorous process was overdue. I did not send anything yet, but the message felt like a door cracking open. We presented the concept to the investors on a hot afternoon in Miami. The room smelled faintly of coffee and salt air drifting through a cracked window. I spoke without a script. I described a place that protected its shorelines with native plantings and shaded its walks with pergolas wide enough for wheelchairs to pass side by side. I talked about textures that could handle the humidity, finishes that could be bleached and repaired without replacing entire rooms, and lighting that made older eyes comfortable without washing the stars from the sky. I broke down revenue by day part and guest behavior. How the design would pull people to spend mornings at the cafe, afternoons at the pool, and evenings in the restaurant that looked like a lantern from the water. The consultant asked about risk if a storm hit mid-season. I walked through worst-case scenarios and the plan to reopen in phases. Another investor asked if the rooms would feel cookie-cutter. I showed him 3 pallets tied to local flora so that each building felt like a cousin rather than a twin. Ethan listened and kept his counsel. When I finished, the room was quiet in the good way. They approved the next phase without a second pitch and set a public milestone that would put our name on the project. The same afternoon, a blog in the Keys ran a small piece that called the scheme thoughtful and real. They said it felt designed for people rather than for photographs. By evening, a larger outlet picked it up with a headline that used my name and the phrase talented designer instead of the labels I had been given for years. Michael sent a note that said the tone was turning and asked again if I was ready with the other documents. I told him not yet and promised I would know when the clock hit 0. Work accelerated. My studio hired 2 more freelancers and my apartment filled with foam models and material boards balanced on dining chairs. I spent hours with the kitchen team planning sightlines so servers could move without collision, and with the spa director timing how long it took guests to transition from locker to sauna to treatment without feeling rushed. I begged a lighting rep to source the last 6 fixtures I needed without bumping the budget, and he found them in a warehouse in New Jersey that no one else had checked. Every small win felt like a stone laid into a bridge I had been building my whole life. One evening as I left the site, the sky over the water went the color of a ripe peach and then deepened into violet. My phone buzzed with a message from Charlotte asking if I was tired yet of playing pretend. I did not answer. A second later, Daniel sent a clip of a rival firm's glossy brochure and a note that said, "This is what real work looks like." I stared at the screen until their names blurred, then slipped the phone into my bag and walked the length of the dock. The sound of ropes creaking against cleats was steady and old, and it calmed me more effectively than any words could. The public milestone arrived on a Saturday with a small ceremony on site. Reporters, local officials, and a handful of invited guests gathered under a white tent as the sea breeze lifted the edges of the banners. I wore a linen dress I had saved for a moment when I wanted to feel like myself without apology. When the microphone came to me, I thanked the team and spoke about the first time I set foot on the property and smelled the mangrove and salt. I told them the design was meant to honor what was already beautiful and to make room for everyone who came after us. Afterwards, a cluster of journalists asked careful questions about budgets and timelines. A correspondent from a national outlet introduced herself and said the story of a young studio leading a responsible coastal build was the kind of news people needed. She asked how I kept the vision clear through the noise. I said that the work teaches you who to listen to and who to forget. She smiled as if she knew exactly what that meant. By the time I got home, a headline waited on my phone that made my throat tighten. Interior designer Olivia Morgan leads next wave of coastal hospitality with resilient human-scale vision. The piece ran with photos of the site and a portrait of me taken in natural light that did not try to make me into anything I was not. The article traced my path from small projects to this commission and quoted a city official who said the plan set a new bar for accessibility. No one called me a failure's daughter. No one implied I was a passenger. I stood in my quiet kitchen and let the words settle. The noise had not disappeared, and I knew my family would find a way to twist even this into a slight. But the ground under my feet felt different. The project was real, the praise was earned, and the label I had carried for so long had begun to fall away on its own. I exhaled slowly, turned off the kitchen light and watched the city beyond my window flicker into night. I had finally stepped out of their shadow, not by asking for their approval, but by proving to myself that I was never the failure they claimed me to be. The proof of that truth started to ripple outward faster than I could have imagined. At first it was whispers. Friends of my parents, the couples they used to vacation with in Palm Beach, the partners from my father's old law firm, even Margaret's charity circle in La Jolla, all began to pull away. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unanswered. Where my parents once held court at every gala, they were now met with polite smiles and quick exits. I heard from Victoria that one of their closest friends, the Whitakers, had declined to attend a dinner after saying bluntly that the Morgans had embarrassed themselves with their favoritism made public. Charlotte's fall came next, and it was brutal. A video clip had leaked on social media showing her mocking me during the San Diego dinner, laughing as she called me a gold digger. Someone spliced the footage with headlines about my design project's success, and within hours, it spread across Instagram and TikTok. The comments turned savage. Former fans accused her of jealousy, and cruelty sponsors began quietly pulling out, and within a week, one of her biggest brand contracts collapsed. She posted a tearful apology video, but it only fueled the backlash, with people calling it performative and insincere. Daniel's reckoning was quieter, but just as sharp. He had been pushing hard for a partnership with a major tech fund, and Ethan's name inevitably came up in the due diligence. When Ethan was asked about it, he simply shook his head and said he could not see himself aligning with someone who treated family like disposable parts. That one comment relayed through the right channels was enough to close doors Daniel thought he had already opened. He tried to downplay it, blaming market conditions, but people in our circle knew the truth. Meanwhile, Richard and Margaret clung to their pride, insisting none of this had anything to do with me. Yet I could see the cracks forming. At a charity luncheon, Margaret arrived with her usual diamonds, but was seated at the far end of the table, no longer the center of attention. Richard's old colleagues, once deferential, now avoided eye contact. For two people who had built their lives around appearances, the humiliation was devastating. I ran into them unexpectedly at a restaurant in Coronado. They were seated near the window, but the usual confident air was gone. Richard looked older, his posture slouched, and Margaret's eyes darted nervously whenever someone walked past. I almost pitied them, but then I remembered the dock in Miami, the laughter as they left me behind, and pity turned to something colder. Back at Ethan's side, I watched everything unfold, like a tide finally turning. It wasn't about revenge in the loud, dramatic sense. It was about karma, steady and undeniable, eroding the foundation they had built on arrogance. For years they had dismissed me as nothing, and now the world was dismissing them. One evening, as the sun set over the Pacific and the sky burned orange, Ethan poured me a glass of champagne and asked if I felt vindicated. I thought about Charlotte's fall from Grace Daniels' lost deal and my parents' fading influence. For the first time, I realized I didn't need to scream that I mattered. Their downfall said it for me. But beneath the satisfaction was something else, something deeper, a question about where this path would lead next. And I knew the story was far from over. The message arrived from Margaret the next afternoon, a short line that said the family wanted to see me at the old house in San Diego. She added that this was a chance to clear the air. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, then set the phone face down and watched the light crawl across my living room wall. Part of me wanted to ignore it and let the silence stand, but a deeper part knew I needed to look them in the eye and finish what years of half-spoken truths had left undone. I called Victoria and told her I might need her on standby. She said she would keep her evening open, and that if anything shifted, I should text her one word. Ethan asked if I wanted company. I told him I needed to do this alone. He said he would be there when I was done. I packed a slim folder into my bag, not as a threat, but as a reminder that I was not walking in empty-handed. Dusk folded over the coast as I drove south. The freeway unwound in long silver lines, and the ocean kept me company on my right. When I turned into the neighborhood where I grew up, the streets felt smaller than I remembered, the trees older, the shadows deeper. The house rose out of the fading light in perfect order, white walls and clean hedges, and a front door polished to a shine. It looked exactly the way Margaret liked to present her life, flawless from the curb. Inside, voices gathered like a tide waiting to break. The living room had been staged for an audience, lamp set low, a tray of mineral water and thin crackers on the coffee table, family photos arranged just so. Richard stood near the mantel, posture, straight face carved into control. Margaret hovered close, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. Daniel lounged on the arm of a chair as if he owned the room. Charlotte sat with her phone held face down, eyes shining with the effort of keeping tears close enough to use. A few relatives flanked the walls, Uncle Robert among them, expression cautious. Grandma Rose sat in the corner on the small blue chair she always claimed quiet and watchful. Richard greeted me with a line about being glad I came. Margaret stepped forward and touched my arm as if we were actors in a reconciliation scene. She said that rumors had gotten out of hand and that I had done damage I did not understand. She said people were talking about the family and that I had made them vulnerable. Daniel added that I was reckless. Charlotte whispered that I had humiliated them. I stood in the middle of the room and let the words circle. When they finished, I said that I would listen to anything honest, but I would not accept blame for the choices they made. I said that they had spoken to the press first and called me a dependent freeloader, and that if they were uncomfortable with the reaction, it belonged to them. Richard shifted into the tone he reserved for juries. He said the press had misunderstood. He said I was endangering the estate by aligning with outsiders. He said my recent attention had made the family a target. He slid a document across the table and said it was a simple non-disclosure agreement that would protect all of us if I would sign. He said it would prevent further embarrassment. I looked at the paper and then at him. I said I would not sign away my voice. I said I did not owe them silence to repair a reputation they had damaged with their own hands. Margaret flinched, then straightened and told me I was being unreasonable. She said a good daughter would help. She said I was choosing a man over blood. I kept my voice even and said that this was not about choosing one person over another. I said this was about choosing myself after a lifetime of being told I did not count. Charlotte let out a small laugh and asked if I believed my own press. Daniel muttered that this was exactly the problem, that I had finally found an audience, and now I was addicted to it. I reached into my bag and touched the folder without taking it out. I said I had brought proof of something they already knew. I said my name and number had been used in accounts I had never consented to, that filings had been made during a merger year, and that if an agency ever asked me to explain it, I would hand over everything. I said I was not here to destroy them. I said I was here to set terms. The room went still in the way it does when a storm veers. Richard stared at me, calculation running through his eyes. Margaret pressed a hand to her pearls as if they could steady her pulse. Daniel began to speak and then stopped. Charlotte sank farther into the chair and looked at the rug. Margaret found her voice first. She said I was threatening my own parents. I said I was protecting myself. I said the day I stood on a dock and was told there was no room for me, I learned exactly what I was to them, and that I had learned something else since then, that I could decide what room I would stand in. Richard asked what I wanted. The question had an edge to it, like he expected a number. I said I wanted my name cleared from any account or filing I had not agreed to. I said I wanted a written confirmation from their counsel and an amended record where one was needed. I said I wanted no more whisper campaigns, no more tips to tabloids, no more invitations to dinners where I would be tried and sentenced for the way I exist. I said I wanted peace and distance. I said they could keep their will the way they wrote it. I said I would not contest a single line. A murmur rippled through the relatives. Uncle Robert looked relieved. Grandma Rose watched me with eyes that glinted like she had been waiting years to hear those words. Daniel scoffed and said I was bluffing. Charlotte asked if I was serious about leaving the money. She said no one walks away from that. I told them I already had. The minute they wrote me out, the minute they told me I was an afterthought, the choice had been made for me. I said I was simply agreeing with what they had declared and adding a condition. They would no longer control me. Richard drew a slow breath and said he would speak with counsel. He said it would take time. I said he had 1 week to begin the process, and that if I heard even one more lie in the press, I would deliver the folder to the first investigative reporter who asked. Michael Grant's card was in my bag. I did not say his name. I did not have to. Margaret stepped toward me then with a tremor of something like grief under her voice. She said we were still family. She said we could start over if I behaved. I told her that family was not a place where you perform for approval. I told her that I wished her health and quiet. I told her that starting over required respect and that I had found it elsewhere. Charlotte pushed her chair back and said I was dramatic. Daniel shoved a hand through his hair and said none of this would matter in a year. Richard told both of them to stop. He looked at me like a man weighing outcomes. He said he had heard me. He said he would handle the paperwork. Grandma Rose stood then and came to me with small, careful steps. She touched my hand and said with the softness only I could hear that I had done well. I nodded and felt the tightness in my chest loosen just enough to breathe. I turned toward the door. No one tried to stop me. In the hallway, the scent of lemon polish and old photographs pressed close. The front door opened onto cool night air and the sound of the ocean breathing beyond the dark. I walked to my car and sat with my hands on the wheel until the quiet settled. My phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. She asked if I needed her to file anything tonight. I typed back that we would give them the week and that she should draft a letter of demands to be sent in the morning. She replied with one word: done. Headlights stroked across the driveway as I pulled away. The house shrank in the rearview mirror and then disappeared behind a row of trees. On the freeway, the lanes opened like a ribbon and the city rose ahead in scattered light. I felt tired in a way that reached bone, but underneath the fatigue was a clean line of certainty. I had said what needed saying. I had given them the chance to act. I had also cut the last string that tethered my worth to their choices. By the time I reached Los Angeles, the night had thinned into the quiet hours before dawn. I parked, climbed the stairs, and stood on my balcony with the cool air on my face. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. I sent Ethan a short message that I was home and safe. Then I set the folder on the table, turned off the lights, and let the dark hold me for a moment longer than usual, knowing morning would bring whatever came next. The next morning came with a light that felt softer, almost forgiving, spilling across the Malibu coastline, as if the ocean itself was reminding me of the endlessness of possibility. Ethan had been up before me, already settled into one of the cedar chairs on the terrace, a mug of coffee in his hand, his eyes following the horizon. Grandma Rose sat beside him, wrapped in a pale shawl, her silver hair catching the glow of the late sun. I stepped out barefoot, the stones still cool under my feet, and for a moment it felt like the three of us were suspended outside of time, bound only by the quiet hum of the waves. We spoke little at first. It was the kind of silence that healed the kind I had longed for, in a house where silence once meant judgment and absence. Grandma Rose reached for my hand, her grip steady, her presence as grounding as it had always been. She asked nothing of me except to be exactly who I was. Ethan leaned back, glanced my way, and smiled in a way that told me I had become more than the woman discarded at a dock in Miami. I had become the woman who had chosen herself. I thought of my parents still wrapped in the chaos of the scandals they had sown, and instead of bitterness, there was only distance. They had their circle crumbling with every headline and every whispered conversation that excluded them, while I had built something new. I had chosen love that did not demand performance, family that did not require humiliation, and a life that no longer bent under the weight of being someone else's afterthought. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in layers of amber and violet, I realized that I no longer needed to ask why they had failed to see me. The answer no longer mattered. What mattered was that I saw myself clear, and whole stronger for every wound that once defined me. I told Grandma Rose and Ethan that for the first time in my life, I did not want their approval or anyone's approval to feel complete. I only wanted to keep choosing the life that honored me. The wind picked up carrying the faint salt of the Pacific, and Ethan poured champagne into 3 flutes. We raised them without ceremony, without grand speeches, only an unspoken recognition of what it meant to arrive at this point together. It was not about the wealth or the view, or even the victory over those who had doubted me. It was about freedom, the kind that settles in your chest and tells you that you are exactly where you belong. As the last light faded and the first stars appeared, I knew the story had closed its circle. The girl left on the dock had been replaced by the woman who now sat on her own terrace, surrounded not by expectation, but by respect and love. The Morgan name could unravel in the courts and on the front pages, but I would not be dragged down with it. If this story touched you, if you have ever felt like the afterthought in your own family, stay with me. There are more journeys of justice and dignity ahead, and together we will keep uncovering them.